Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to go over 7 books that I recommend reading in 2022. And I'm going to rank each book based on 3 categories. Number 1, ROI, return on investment, basically how long it took me to read the book versus what I got from the book. Number 2, utility, which is the skills, techniques, methods, the things that you're gonna learn. And number 3 is how fun it was to read. And to make it interesting, let's do 1 to 5 stars. So let's get right into it. First up is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So good. If there's any book that I could recommend to everyone, it would be this book, because of the impact that it has whenever you read it in proportion to the size. It's like 150 pages, so really easy. Frankl was a neurologist and a psychiatrist who spent 3 years of imprisonment in the Nazi concentration camps. In the book, Frankl describes his experience and the horrible conditions and torture and death that characterized daily life in the camps. But in all that chaos, Frankl decided to study his own experience and watch others around him. And in doing so, that's actually where the central thesis of the book was found. He decided that forces outside of his control could take away everything from him except for one thing, and that was his freedom to choose how he responded in any situation. One of the things that he noticed was that fellow prisoners who may have been physically stronger than others, but fell into the pitfalls of nihilism and resentment, were often the first to die. On the other hand, he found that fellow prisoners that remained hopeful for the future were often the ones who tended to recover and ultimately to survive. That was the basis for what Frankl calls the will to meaning. Essentially, the claim is that the pleasure that we're all after is actually a byproduct of meaning, and it's the meaning that's actually going to sustain us in life, not in the getting the stuff. Fantastic book. Like I said, it's a short read, and I don't have enough time to get into all the things that I took away from the book, but it's number 1 on my list for a reason. And if you haven't read it, there's a link to the book in the description. For ROI, I would give this book 5 stars. In terms of utility, I would also give it 5 stars because Frankl takes a lot of the things that he learned in his time in the concentration camps and then turns them into psychological principles. And 5 stars for fun reading, 5 stars across the board. I love this book. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. Moving on. This next one is an old book. It was published back in the 70s, and I actually found it online secondhand. I think I found it at Abe Books. And when it arrived, I found this really cool custom letterpress on the title page. And come to find out, I did a quick Google search, and the previous owner of the book is actually some ex-pharmaceutical executive, so that's interesting. The next book on my list is Systemantics by John Gall. The author, John Gall, was a physician and a professor at the University of Michigan, and this book is his attempt to create a theory for how systems work. Essentially, the premise is that life has a basic problem, what he calls the primal scenario, and that is that things in general aren't working very well. Entropy is undefeated, but in an attempt to delay entropy, humans try to solve problems. And when we find solutions to those problems, we then try to convert those solutions into systems. But the main point that Gall tries to make about these solutions is that they don't actually solve anything. New systems just mean new problems. And in reality, when you put a system in place, you're really just substituting one set of problems for another. And there's a lot of really cool principles in the book. One of them talks about how systems generally tend not to work in terms of producing the desired outcome. And when they do work, it's often best to just leave them alone. There's also a concept that he talked about in the book that I really liked, which he called catalytic managership, which is essentially the idea that trying to make your goals happen oftentimes doesn't work, and it's really, really hard to do. But it is possible to remove the obstacles that you think might get in your way. Basically, trying to clear the runway before you take off so you reduce the chances of running into obstacles whenever you're trying to make progress in your goals. In terms of ROI, I would give this book a 4. There's a lot of great points. It's a very short book, but I wish that there would have been more detail. In terms of utility, you're going to be able to apply these concepts to basically every aspect of your life that uses some sort of system. So I would give this book a 5. And in terms of reading enjoyment, I would give this book a 3. Like I said, the concepts in the book are great. Wasn't a huge fan of the author's style though. It's less than 100 pages and systems are such a universal part of everyday life. I definitely think it's worth a read. Next up, we have Beyond Order by the one and only Jordan Peterson. This book is part 2 of a series, the follow-up to Peterson's other book, 12 Rules for Life. Initially, I read this book last April 2021, shortly after the book was released. It's essentially 12 more of the life rules that Peterson has become so well known for. Some of my favorite rules in the book are number 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. The concept is that avoiding conflict does not eliminate it. Essentially, what you're doing is just delaying conflict, and ultimately, you tend to magnify it the longer you draw it out. Rule number 5, do not do what you hate. And rule number 8, which is one of my favorites, try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I would recommend this book to anybody for general life advice. Relationships, self-improvement, productivity, philosophy. There's all the classic references to slaying the dragon and ancient Mesopotamian myths and biblical references. It's all in there. I support the man's work. He is one of the reasons why I started reading again in the first place. In terms of ROI, I would give this book a 4. In terms of utility, I would give this book a 5. And in terms of fun, I would give this book a 5 as well. It's a really interesting read. Beyond Order, Jordan Peterson. On to the next. By the way, the sponsor for today's video is no one. My channel isn't that big yet. Next up, I got a lot of value out of this book. This is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. Shoe Dog is basically an autobiography about the creation story of Nike. Fresh out of graduate school, 1960s, Knight decides to take a year off and travel to Japan. On that trip, he makes a visit to a shoe manufacturer named Onitsuka. A deal is made. He creates the company Blue Ribbon Sports, which eventually becomes Nike, and the rest is history. Genuinely, this is one of the most entertaining and insightful books if you run a business, if you are thinking about starting a business, or if you love sports and you just want to read an entertaining and well-written story about how one guy's love for running and for shoes turned into a multi-billion-dollar company. It's a really fun and easy read on its own, but you can also study it like a field manual. And that's how I approached it. When I was designing for my own clothing company, I studied a lot of the basic concepts in this book, and I learned a lot about brand building, about financing, managing growth, and a lot of other great business tips. ROI, I would give this book a 4. For utility, I would give this book a 5. Very good business tips in here. And for fun, enjoyment, and reading, I would give this book a 5 too. It was a really well-written story. I like Knight's writing style, 5 stars. One of my favorite parts of the book were the chapters where Knight talks about some of the early negotiations that took place and the conception of Nike. And there's another book on that topic that's really great. It's called Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Roger Fisher and William Ury. Negotiation is a fact of life. We all negotiate something every single day. Plus, we have to deal with the fact that conflict is now a growth industry. So moving forward, learning how to negotiate better with more ethical and solid principles is a skill that I think everybody would benefit from. The book breaks everything down into 3 main parts. The first part is the problem. This is the section that talks about the main friction points that people tend to run into whenever they disagree. Some of those friction points include avoiding saving face or digging into your position early on in the argument. And there's another point that I liked a lot. Don't deduce another person's intentions based on your fears, which I thought was really well said. Section 2 is on methods, which is all about addressing those friction points. One of my favorite techniques that I took from this book was looking for opportunities to act inconsistently with the other person's perceptions. We often go into conflict seeing the other person as an adversary that we have to defeat. But if you can act in a way that breaks that preconception and gives the person a reason to doubt some of their reservations about you, you can start to make progress toward a solution. And the third section is called Yes, But, and it's a very good part of the book. Basically, it addresses a lot of the caveats that people tend to make. We all tend to believe that our specific situation is the exception and not the rule. And this section of the book addresses some of those issues, like negotiating with people who are more powerful than you or in a position of higher authority, and also negotiating with people who use tricky techniques, aggressive tactics to kind of bully their way into a position. I'm personally somebody who really doesn't like conflict, so this book helped me a lot in being able to maintain my composure whenever I disagree with somebody, and also being positive and supportive towards the person, but difficult and tough on the issue. ROI, I would give this book 5 stars. It's less than 200 pages and you learn a lot from it. For utility, I would give this book a 5 as well, because there's a lot of really practical applications that are all research-based. And for fun, I would give this book a solid 4. Next up, where to begin with this book? I read this book initially last year whenever I was making the decision to go back to school, and I wanted a quick refresh on some of the essential concepts in chemistry and biology, but I didn't necessarily want to read an entire textbook on the subject. So I stumbled upon this book written by Professor Franklin Harold. It's called The Way of the Cell, and I cannot tell you how blown away I was by how good this book is. Harold managed to touch on all the major concepts that you would learn in a 4-year biology degree in just 250 pages. He does a really good job of laying out clearly and simply all the things that we know about life, beginning with the basic building blocks of molecules and cells, expanding out to complex issues like Darwinian evolution, with a little bit of philosophy sprinkled in. However, he's not afraid to state just as simply and clearly all the things that science can't account for. In the last chapter, he writes about the origins of life, giving an account of all the main theories of how the world and the universe that we know came into existence. And there's an excerpt from the opening paragraph that I want to share. My reason for placing the origin of life at the top of the agenda is that resolving this question is required in order to anchor living organisms securely in the physical world of matter and energy, and thus relieve the lingering anxiety as to whether we have read nature's book correctly. Creation myths lie at the heart of all human cultures, and science is no exception. Really good book, fantastic way to learn about some really big concepts. ROI, I would give this book a 5 based on how much information is contained in such a short book. For utility, I would give this book a 4. And for fun reading, I would give this book a 5 as well. Franklin does a really good job of making a lot of these complex topics entertaining, easy to understand. Well done. And finally, we have the longest book on this list. This is The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's a 3-volume series and it's very long. I think I read somewhere that it's almost 1,000,000 words, and I don't know if that's true, but if it is, that is pretty impressive because that makes it longer than the Bible, so that's pretty crazy. Solzhenitsyn changed the world forever in the 1970s when he published this book. It was really the first book to shed a light on all of the atrocities of the Soviet Union system under Lenin and Stalin. You're probably familiar with the famous quote from this book that says, "The line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." And this book, this tome of a book, is a firsthand experience about how a nation can fall into chaos by crossing that line one step at a time. It's about a lot more than one man's experience. This is a textbook on the human condition. But if you're not up to reading all 3 volumes, you could really get away with just reading the first volume because it basically sums up all the main points. Absolutely necessary. It is a marathon of a book, but I plan on reading it many times throughout the course of my life, and it's a book that I think everyone should read at least once. ROI 5 stars, utility 5 stars, fun reading 3 stars. Oh, one more thing. As I was going through my list of books, I realized that I didn't have any fiction in this list. So I'll have to make another video on that sometime. But for now, I wanted to add 1 book of fiction to the list as sort of a bonus for those of you that made it this far into the video. This is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is my favorite book. It's a really great story. It's about murder, tortured conscience, the ethical consequences of a world devoid of God. I don't have enough time to get into this work today, but it's really good. Classic work by my favorite author. Give it a read. Absolutely 5 stars across the board. Anyway, that wraps up the books that I would recommend reading in 2022. If you want me to go into more detail about any of these books in the future, or if you like this content, give me a shout in the comments. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe so you can follow more of my content. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one.